This conference will now be recorded.
No. Come on. What's the problem here? Come on. Oh, it looks like your host is going to have to like reboot or something. What's going on? Ah, here we go. It's just really slow. I got a lot of tabs open. Bad on me. Mr. Pearson.
Yeah. Is it centered correctly? Can you see me?
I can. I mean, there's a lot of nose and not so much chin, but yes.
Okay. Well, I can. How about that? Is that better?
That's much better.
Okay.
Lawless is
Yeah.
in the
For some reason, I'm not getting my own picture on the screen, so I can't tell if it's centered.
Oh,
There
you're
it
fine now. Okay, I'm going to show you this video, and you guys tell me what you think. There is no sound. Come on. Come on. There we go. You can tell me what that device is all about.
Uroflowmetry measurements?
Andrew, good. Andre.
Andre.
Andre, yeah.
I should know to say that. I'm from Canada, so I should know to say that.
And why is this a big deal?
Very big deal. That's
Why?
a very unique way to do it. The
So
dynamic measurement of a urinary episode.
In real time.
Yep.
With a $5 disposable and a reusable handle that lasts for 10 years.
Does it create the graph automatically?
Creates any voiding data you require. It measures everything about the void. It does it to an accuracy that's equal to a $8,000 gravimetric unit. And it goes in her purse or it goes in his briefcase. Completely portable.
That's excellent. I'm very familiar with the field. I've got two patents in the field.
Oh, do you really? Yeah. Okay. This works with the new Cat M1 cellular. So everything's automatic. There's no buttons on it, no dials, no off and on, nothing to adjust. It's point and shoot. Take it out of the bag, use it, put it back in the bag, done. So we're looking at, obviously the clinic market for Euroflows and voiding diaries. We've got a lot of interest amongst hospitals for monitoring I&O in the post-acute care setting. We've got a lot of interest from cardiology and chronic kidney, in terms of monitoring urine output after hospital discharge.
Sure. And what does it transmit to?
Transmits to the cloud. All the data is sent by cellular to the cloud, and then from the CarePath cloud, we can organize the data. Everything's handled at the servers at the cloud level, so we can analyze the data any way you want. There's a
What is the transmission? Maybe I wasn't clear. What is the transmission from the disposable? Where is that transmitting to?
Well, we basically have a server set up, a data center set up.
Okay.
So this gets sent to, we will eventually end up on AWS or one of the large data server companies just because of cost efficiency.
Right.
There's a phone app that goes with it for avoiding diaries, so you can input any sort of information you want about fluid intake, things like that.
No, it looks great. Congratulations. I see a big market for that.
Huge market for that. But there's nothing like it. It's the only device of its type like that in the world.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
This is Brent's background before it goes to market.
Yeah.
Next time it's just going to be water.
This is the background from the last time I went to market in 2014. Show us what this is.
What's that?
This is from the time I went to market in 2014. The background. I sold a company to Medtronic in 2014. So.
He's doing okay.
Looks great.
Thank you.
And I get a free trip out of it. I'm flying to Tennessee next week to take video with this guy.
Very good.
I mean, I would have chosen a different destination, but I'm just happy to get out of the house.
Yeah, I want to picture me taking Joe to eat to the heart of the Appalachian Mountains.
I'm going to be so well behaved. I am going to be so well-behaved. You won't even recognize me.
Lecture before he gets there.
No, I'm going to be very polite to everyone I meet.
I told him everybody in East Tennessee carries, so be careful what you say.
Really? You need to go there?
Oh yeah.
Hey, Brent, the two versions that are,
Work that everybody carries there.
Brent, the question on the two versions I saw in the video, is that male, female?
Yeah, male, female. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, it's the same technology, but we had to, obviously, because anatomy changed the angles on it. But basically, I don't know, everybody wants to see 1 second.
In the meanwhile, before we start with Peter, Glenn, you're a first timer. Will you introduce yourself to everybody?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Versions, they're not boring anybody, but basically
That's one thing I should tell you. You can't talk over Brent.
No,
you just power through.
I've seen some of the previous videos, so I've learned some things.
Years in the operating room to get talked over. So basically, this is its disposable portion. This is durable, reusable. It's got RFID chips in here, so once it's used by one patient, many times as they want, it can't be used by a different patient. So we have automatic in-field, real-time inventory. This also has an RFID chip, so we know which handle's attached to which device at all times.
Doctor, we're going to have Glenn introduce himself, please.
What's that?
I'm going to ask Glenn to introduce himself. He's a first timer.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this group. It looks like a very astute collection of innovators, so that's exciting.
People on today's call, so the rest of the calls are not going to go as smoothly.
Okay, all right, sounds good. My background is on the hospital side. I spent 30 years in the hospital industry. I was executive vice president at Georgia Hospital Association for more than 19 years. I have background in academic medical center up in Michigan and acute care, and then 2 different associations. And my primary areas at Georgia Hospital Association were working with policy, finance, data, technology, entrepreneurial services, communications, things like that. And a few years ago, I founded a company called Pearson Health Tech Insights. And what I basically done with that, I built myself as a bridge between the executives and the technology folks. My background's more in the kind of data IT-ish side as opposed to devices, but a lot of the principles apply in either direction. And I'm very pleased that just in September, CRC Publishers, which is part of HIMSS, you can see the HIMSS logo on the corner there, published my book called Thriving in the Healthcare Market, Strategies from an Industry Insider for Selling Your Product. And what I've done is I've identified 84 pitfalls and problems I've seen trip up various vendors trying to sell in the healthcare. For 24 years, a small part of my job was being the interface between vendors who wanted to be endorsed by the 2 different associations I work for and the executives in the state. So I've seen hundreds of presentations and approaches toward the market. Some of them are really good and some of them are absolutely awful. So what this book does is it encapsulates all the things I've seen people do wrong, and I have about 200 suggestions on how to minimize or even avoid entirely what these problems are. So it's gotten great response so far. It's only been out a month or so, and very pleased that I can offer something like this to the industry. One of my best, I had an unsolicited reader comment. They said, reading your book gave me some PTSD because I realized how many mistakes we made, but it's an excellent resource and you should be very proud of that. So that's a little bit about what I do.
And we're going to have you be a featured guest in a coming week, perhaps in early January.
Okay, that'd be wonderful.
So thank you for that. And let's see. Leslie, I don't know if you've joined a call before. Are you willing to put on your camera today? Leslie? Well, John's willing to put on his camera today.
Yeah, I've been out shooting squirrels. Sorry about that.
Really?
Yeah.
That sounds like Tennessee.
South Carolina.
I know.
You're serious, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I've got about 4 or 5 acres here, so we're surrounded by forest and different from Silicon Valley, I tell you.
And the shooting of the squirrels, is that for food?
Not yet. We're not that bad. But no, they're a pest. They get everywhere, and if you let them get too much, they start chewing on electrical.
Yes.
And we've got a pool and pool equipment that I'm hoping to protect.
Okay, this is probably another conversation then.
Yeah.
All right, fair enough. And there's a name I don't recognize at all, Tom Zarella. Tom, are you there? Well, okay. Why don't we then, difficulties with mic and audio today. Okay, well, we'll meet you next time. Peter, why don't we start with the reason we're all gathered here together. I want to introduce Peter just a bit because I consider him a friend. Not that you all aren't, but in certain ways. But Peter was introduced to me when I last had a job, and that was a long time ago. I'm now very unemployable. But back in the day, when somebody was willing to employ me, I inherited Peter's company as our translation firm for cardiac science, where we sold defibrillators all over the world. And therefore, we needed our IFUs and other things translated in many different tongues, as well as our marketing communication. We had our office in Manchester that was for our international division, and I had a vociferous group of individuals, each of whom thought that this was the correct way to say it in French, and this was the correct way to say it in German, and there was lots of back and forth.
I've been through that.
And we got through Agile and had people finally come around to say, okay, we can agree upon this translation. Thank you. We're ready to go. And with that, Peter Argondizzo, ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together.
Well, it's nice to meet all of you, and thank you for that introduction, Joe. Yeah, that was some years ago. In terms of my background relative to this space, I was a project manager for a company called Marquette Electronics in Milwaukee, and their specialty was carts. They did all sorts of stress carts. They had treadmills that they made. Then they got into bedside monitors when they bought a division of GE. And shortly after I left the company to start Argo Translation, they were then acquired by GE. So we quickly sort of got a specialty, if you will, in medical devices. And then we were fortunate enough to start working with cardiac sciences and then space labs, and now with a host of other medical device companies as well. We are ISO 9001, 13485, and 17100 registered. We do specialize in complex projects, all sorts of formats, whether it's Madcap Flare, FrameMaker, InDesign, all sorts of mobile applications. And we are just about to complete our 25th year of business. And very thankful to have known Joe all these years, and of course, would love to help anyone I can in our community with any translation issues or questions, even if it's, you know, you're not quite there yet, but you're working on it and want to understand some best practices. I'm happy to help. Please consider us as a resource. Reach out anytime. And just out of curiosity, does anyone have any questions about translations? Anyone dealing with any of that right now? Happy to answer anything, since your client review is obviously a very big topic. I heard John mention it as well, and of course Joe lived through that pain. But we have some really good ways of mitigating client review and getting buy-in from the in-country folks and not alienating them. All too often they say, why do we need to go to Chicago to get French translation when I'm here in Paris? And we quickly make them our friends rather than our enemies. We have some really good strategies to do that and make them a part of the process. So, you know, again, happy to answer any questions.
Talk about that for a minute. I remember an individual in France who was particularly nettlesome. And I would come back with Peter's work and he would be like, that's not how we say it in Paris. How do you respond to, I'm in Paris, I'm a native Parisian, why do I need this guy?
So yeah, our translators are all native speakers, so they're really on equal footing to the folks that are in country. But the difference is what we do in terms of the back end or the technology. We use translation memory technology, so it's not machine translation, but what it does is very smart. It memorizes every sentence of translation we do, so it gets committed to a database. And the reason that's important is because, you know, most of the device manufacturers we work with do iterations on their products. So that's really important because you tend to add features to your feature set. And what you don't want to do is when you go through that process of getting review and approval, when the next version of your product comes around, the last thing you want to do is reinvent the wheel and start the translation over again. Well, we can lock into place anything that's been previously approved. So we're always only working on the differential, only on new content. And we have audit history on every single sentence. So, you know, that's why you want to use someone that's really a professional translation service provider with translation memory technology, good workflow, accredited translators. That's really important. And I can tell a story. Back when I was at Marquette Electronics, we had a French distributor translate the materials. Our CEO at the time said, well, you know, we have these resources. We have offices all over the world. You know, let's use some of those folks to do translation. The in-country manager didn't like Marquette because it had sort of, Marquette was, for those of you that know, he was an explorer that explored heavily the Mississippi River Valley. And they said, oh, it has sort of colonial implications. We don't like the name. So they changed the name of the company and the logo. So when Marquette went to market in France, they had a different company name. Needless to say, that was the last time that a translation was ever done outside of the four walls at Marquette Electronics. So there's a lot of branding risk, and they'll often just eliminate sections. You kind of want that intermediary that's going to protect your brand, protect your intent, but yet get buy-in from those countries so they feel like they're part of the team. So it's even more than the language. There's that sort of that political landscape that your translation provider has to navigate for you.
A technical note, somebody's echoing you. I'm not sure who. So maybe let's mute those people who aren't talking so that we don't have that. But by all means, this is an open mic thing. So as soon as you want to contribute something, put your mics back on. And Peter, a marketing note, if you've never made a video that explained what you just explained, you should.
I actually have one.
Oh, good.
Yeah, good. I do. I can share it, but thank you. Yeah, the client review is for not only just our folks that are in the medical device world, but it's a political discussion. And if you,
the notion of the database shuts down any Tom in Paris argument, because God give Tom long life when someone else is in the Paris office and they use a different word for the same thing, and it's in one IFU like this and one IFU like that. Well, then it's an IFU to the company, isn't it? You see what we did there?
Very good, Joe. You're absolutely right. The audit trail is really important because we get that too sometimes where, you know, they give it to, you know, there's an IFU and it goes to one person in the office, let's say the French office, and then the next IFU goes to another person, and they change everything that the other person approved. By using that audit trail, we say, well, guys, we have to make a decision. Last time it was this and it was approved. Now you want to change this term to this. So it's important to have that audit trail as well.
Do you want the screen? Did you want to show us anything? Because you had some like watch outs, or you just want to talk through them, which is fine. This is a casual call.
Yeah, I think chatting through them is better than slides.
Okay.
I think the translation memory technology is a big thing. I think for anyone that's looking to purchase translation, that's super important. Make sure your provider's doing that. I would also make sure that they have, I want to make sure it's not me. It's not me echoing, no. You want to make sure that they have the 13485. I think that ISO requirement is really important. It means that they're putting enough energy into their quality management system. They feel strongly enough about what they're doing to make that investment. Not all translation providers have ISO 13485. I think that's important.
Educate me, is that, and Larry, you can certainly tell me, Larry's former FDA for 21 years. Is ISO 1345, my only exposure to it is in medical devices. How many industries does that regulation cover? Larry, do you know? Mr. Stevens? Or Karthik, do you know? Okay, I've stumped the crowd.
Well, as far as I know, ISO 1345 is strictly med device.
Yeah, my understanding too. There are other standards for aerospace and
Exactly, different numbers.
Okay. So, Peter, you must have a pretty good sense of your competitive set. How many translation houses do you know that have 1345s?
It's a handful, and it's because of the investment. Mainly the big guys like the TransPerfects of the world, they certainly do it. Our scale, they typically don't. The smaller firms don't. They don't necessarily believe in the investment. I think it's key. I mean, speaking honestly and just candidly, when we first were forced to do the ISO 9001 registration by GE, that was probably about 15 years ago, I thought it was a bit of a waste of time. I thought, gosh, we have good quality standards. Why do we need to do this? I was fortunate enough to get a really good consultant that showed us how it could be a good tool internally. And we've used it as a really good platform for continual improvement. So I think we sort of bent, when I say bent, we made it fit for us, because some of the things don't fit, right? Like 13485, like there is no translation clean room. Like there is no sterilization. There's certain parts of the 13485 that don't even pertain to us. However, I like to think of it as the religion of process. And I think that's been really important for us. And I think that's what helps, a buyer understand, like, what are these people doing with quality? Because it's a very subjective business. We write a translation, someone could look at it and say, I don't like it. But we have really good processes to deal with that. And that would be another good suggestion, is when you get that so-called, the Tom person in Paris who's very difficult and says, I don't like it. As a buyer, to be fair to your provider, you should always request a markup. Because like anything, if Joe writes something as a consultant in English for a brochure and the client says, Joe, I hate it. That doesn't give Joe any ability to say, well, what don't you like about it? What sections do I need to rewrite? Is it tone? Is it style? Is it terminology? By just simply saying, I don't like it, it's not correct, you're not really enabling or empowering your translation vendor to do a better job. And again, remember, they have that translation memory database. So when we see markups, like what we want to see are terminology markups. Hey, we don't like the style. Our user base is a bunch of physicians and it feels like you're speaking down to them. No, but like that's the kind of feedback we're looking for. But when we have terminology changes, those all go into the database so that then when we see the content again, our translators are prompted. This is the term that's preferred, and they have to stick to it. We can actually make the system reject the job that doesn't use the terminology that's approved. So that's the type of feedback you really want to get from your people, is concrete, solid evidence, not just, I don't like it.
My limited knowledge of many languages, I'm not a polyglot, but I was almost fluent in Spanish once. I'm thinking that this could be the difference between tú and vosotros.
Absolutely. That's definitely one of them is, will you be using the formal? We always tell our folks as well to write in the active voice. That really helps in translation. And careful with the marketing message. Another story that I have back from my Marquette days is from the marketing group, they wanted to launch a campaign that was the art of cardiology. And in the brochures and in the materials, they were equating the tools that Marquette was providing was going to allow the cardiologist to quote unquote perform his or her artistry. And what we quickly had to tell them is that in Italy and in other parts of Europe, they view artists as vagrants and physicians as demigods. So unfortunately, equating a physician to an artist would have been very insulting. So we actually put the kibosh on that campaign before it even went to translation. And of course, they had to bounce it off of the in-country people, and they reinforced exactly what we said, what the project manager said. But that's the kind of thing you have to be careful of, is, who is the audience? And those are the things that your translation provider should help you with in terms of tone and setting the proper message in country.
How often do you run into, Peter, instances where the language just clashes completely? Like when we were selling the Chevy Nova down in Mexico and South America, Nova means in Spanish, no go. So do you see just a bunch of that, or are those the things that your guys, that people before you will usually catch?
Well, it's interesting. There's, two schools of thought. There are some companies that, say, damn the torpedoes straight ahead, and they don't care to hear it. But we've seen a lot more of our clients, when they look to launch a new product, they'll do a bit of a naming study. So they'll say, we've come up with these names. We're looking to go into these 12 markets. Can you run it by your teams? Ask them, does it sound like anything? Does it rhyme with anything silly? Does it sound anywhere near a curse word or anything that's off color? So we'll do just an analysis, say, on a set of 10 names or 20 prospective names, and we'll run it across all the different countries that they're looking at. And we'll have our lead marketing linguists look at that and just report. And, thankfully, any catastrophes are usually avoided that way. And it's not a very expensive project either. So it's a good step. And I've seen more of that over the 25 years. When we first started 25 years ago, that level of understanding wasn't there. You would talk to someone in Joe's position and they'd say, no, this is the name we're going to use. I don't really care. Now it's much different. People understand that anything they release has to have the entire world in mind before they go to market. Good question. I guess I have a question. How many on the call today have had to deal with translations, and any interesting stories, nightmares, or anything that they think is relevant to the discussion that they'd like to share?
So this is Justin. I worked on translations within software on 2 touchscreens on a device, and at one point we were looking into various languages in India, and I think we came up with, I don't know, close to 20 some dialects. It became a very interesting what goes into the product and what does not discussion, which took several months to resolve.
Interesting. So was that feature set? You were looking at different features, or is that where the discussion was?
No, it's just do we put Punjab in, and where would that, what regions would that cover? What did we put in there enough for it to be sufficient for those countries? And I think we eventually narrowed it down to 3 dialects that we felt would be sufficient for coverage, but just looking at what exists and how many languages are really there was an eye-opener to a lot of people.
That's great, Justin. Thanks for sharing that. We do get that a fair amount with companies that are newly, they're looking to release globally for the first time, and they'll sometimes say, well, we're looking to do Spanish. Similar type of thing. Well, my gosh, are you going to Spain? Are you going to Latin America? Are you staying in the U.S.? Because that's another concern, is if you're doing Spanish for the U.S., what populations are you going to cover inside of the U.S.? Some people are like, oh, we do all of our business in South Florida. Well, okay, well, that's a different discussion than saying, yeah, we're definitely strong in all 50 states and we have to do a Spanish that's neutral. Those are really good things to think about. And I always tell people to try to look at their customer base. When we're doing websites, what's nice is you can look at Google Analytics and really hone in on which countries are generating most of your traffic, and then you can tailor your decisions. Because especially now, and I don't know if this discussion's come up at all, but Google used to allow you to bury a widget on your website, and you could just say, okay, my website's in 72 languages, and it would use the Google Translate engine to create it. So all too often, we'll get calls from a small company and they'll say, yeah, we'd like to translate our website in 72 languages. Well, we do work for Northrop Grumman, for GE Healthcare, large corporations that don't do their stuff in 72 languages. So you say when you're talking to a smaller firm, why is that? Because Google does it. Well, the first thing we do is talk them off of that cliff and say, listen, let's look at your traffic. Let's spend your money in an intelligent way. Let's look at where you're generating revenue. Because if we're doing our job correctly, the work we do should generate revenue for you, or it should solve a problem. Like employee communications, you're trying to communicate to your employees all over the globe. So it's one of those two things that we're trying to solve. And the last thing we want to do is just have people throw money at a bunch of languages that'll never generate a cent of revenue. But yeah, we've had similar things. We did, Honeywell HomeMed is a client of ours, and now they're called Residio, but they do an in-home healthcare device for geriatric patients that can't get out. So it's BP, weight, blood sugars, and they can take a tablet and do a FaceTime session, essentially a screen session with a PA or with a nurse. And it was interesting because we had to figure out really where their markets were, and we had to do we did a specific dialect of Spanish to help them better connect with their clients. And it's really important that you don't, if you're looking at Brazilian Portuguese or French or where there's different dialects or concerns, honing in on the region, the most important regions are important. Good call, Justin.
Peter, I remember we're talking now 10 years ago. So I've known you for 12 now. How do you like that? I was in charge, you'll recall, of launching the brand new website. And I remember back in my youth thinking, oh, look, Google Translate. Can't I just put this in the top right-hand corner of the site? And no offense to you, but save us some money with translation. And I remember the answer is no, you can't. But can you remind me why that's so profoundly not good enough?
Yeah, it's not really there for customer-facing technology. In our business, you'll hear a lot of people talk about machine translation, and it certainly has a role in our business, but it's just that, it's a role. For customer-facing materials, you'll see some errors that are just terrible. And what'll happen is it'll translate 12 sentences or even a section or so quite well, and you say to yourself, well, this is great, but there's those little gotchas that will cost. And of course, for this audience in a very highly regulated industry where there's a lot of risk involved with errors, that's where it'll get you in trouble. And quite frankly, there's levels of service that you can use saying, just one linguist without a reviewer. Like if it's non-essential materials, you could potentially find a level of service that will meet your budget. But using MT out of the box for customer facing is tough. It's usually will lead you to an error. I can tell you a story. We have a client of ours that makes a tiny little product, and the translation bill for his package would have been $75. One of his people decided they would go it on their own, and they used Google Translate. And then they retyped the material that went into the package, and they dropped the the enye, which is the little tilde that goes above the N in años, which becomes anus. And they shipped that product to Target, and they refused it, sent it back to them, and it was about $100,000 to repackage. It would have cost them $75 to have us do it.
Yeah, this is Glenn. This is a little bit off track, but I've seen translation. I'm sorry?
We encourage off-track
tangents. Good. I'm seeing translation issues of a non-linguistic side. The book I was just referencing has 8 target audiences, and 2 of them have translation issues. And the 2 examples are companies from overseas that have a viable healthcare product that are trying to bring it here. Well, they don't even know how to spell Medicaid, and they never heard of Affordable Care Act and all that stuff. So there's that whole kind of translation to the U.S. healthcare sector. And then the other type of translation issue is a company that has a viable product in another vertical other than healthcare, things like HR or scheduling, where they maybe want to start getting the scheduling facilities, perhaps OR scheduling, that type of thing. And if they don't understand the quirks and peculiarities of how healthcare works in hospitals and physicians, they're going to run into the ANO issues instead of ANYO. So it's not a linguistic translation, but translation is important in other sectors.
That's actually a really good point, Glenn. We do an ebook that has top 10 things to consider, and that is one of them, is the regional considerations, 911, Medicare, Affordable Care Act. You could go down the list of things that are specific to our world, and any good translator would bring those things to the attention of the client when they're translating, say, all right, well, this is what we suggest, calling emergency medical services, making things a little bit more vague, so that they'll apply for more audiences,
right.
And that's important.
Right. Yep.
I went to the radiology show. Oh, this was some years ago. The big radiology show that I think they still do it in Chicago.
RSNA.
I'm sorry.
It should be around this time.
Yes, exactly. And I was just walking the floor, and there was a provider there from China, and they had this big, beautiful booth. It looked like it cost a fortune. And they had the easiest of typos on there. So I took a picture because I wanted to put it on in an article that I was working on. And a young lady walked up to me and said, "Oh, you really like our booth?" I said, "I do. It's awesome, except for that typo." And she was quite embarrassed. So I let her know that hopefully they would fix it. And it was a silly little thing. But again, 10 minutes of a linguist time, and they would have saved themselves that grief. So now she had the torture of going through that whole show knowing that they had a pretty egregious typo on the main header of their big, expensive display. So it happens.
So do you have a service where where people can just take early drafts of or semi-final drafts of a presentation or a brochure or something like that, and they may be going, we think we've got this right, but you've got a service where they could send things into you and you could just review it for common errors. Maybe they go, we don't want to, we just want it back in a few days or a week or something like that. We don't want to go into an in-depth thing, but we don't want it to look like boneheads. So is there a service like that?
From a marketing perspective, I'm intrigued by Rick's question. Rick, are you saying, can I reach Peter without having him translate my whole damn thing? And if so, what is it you're really asking him to do? Edit the English suitability for translation?
Could be that, but it could be, yes, we're headed down to Brazil, where they don't speak Spanish necessarily, it's all Portuguese, or we're headed to northern Mexico, or we're going to be displaying in Mexico City, which is slightly different Spanish and different inflections from Mexico proper, things like that. We've got presentations, or we've got banners or local booths or whatever it is we're doing, and this is the draft of what we're planning on putting up there. And just, have we done anything boneheaded? We've got a ton of people working on this. We're in a big hurry. We're going to miss things. And because here's my reason for asking this question, is that I had one customer, and I designed things, and I had one customer, and all I ever did for him was find people. He was a guy out in California starting a left ventricle assist device, and all I did for him, I think I found him half a dozen people. And over several months, I didn't design one thing for him. He already had his design. And so one of the things that's great is knowing people who are fantastic resources, and knowing, for instance, in your case, whether, we're just going to do something if it's a whole manual or a marketing scenario, or if you'll do little things, you'll keep us from totally embarrassing ourselves. Here's what here's our banner, here's our display, here's what we want to put up there.
It's a good question, Rick. And both scenarios that Joe mentioned are things that we do for people. I wish more people would come to us before they spend a lot of money, because what happens sometimes is the English will be buried and done, and it's on a site, and there's a ton of brochures printed, and then we give people bad news. Now, in theory, maybe it still works in the US, and what we do is we modify the source before it gets translated, and it's all fine.
What does
In other
that
words,
mean exactly? You give them bad news?
So, for example, let's go back to the art of cardiology. They rolled with that thing in the US. But what happened is, just put do not disturb on, sorry about that. They rolled with that campaign in the US, but then the campaign outside of the US looked very different. So we could have maybe saved them the grief before they, and this is internal to the company I was working with. They had already committed to what they were going to do in the US. But
I
we
would
changed
imagine idioms have a lot to do with it.
Oh gosh, of course. Yeah, that comes up
That's
a fair
probably
amount.
all unto itself.
Yeah, and you see less of it. I feel like, enough of it has been circulated. You know, the stories of the Chevy Nova and the Pepsi thing with, their slogan that when translated was "We bring the dead alive." You know, those sort of things. These marketing nightmare stories have been circulating for a while. So I feel like people are in tune and they look at this a little bit better than they did 25 years ago or even a
I can't
decade
imagine
ago.
what that was. I know GE brings good things to life.
Pepsi had one. It was a generational one. I think it was back in the Michael Jackson era when he set his hair on fire. It was I forget, that slogan was the one that in translation when they went into China, "We bring the dead back to life" is what it translated as. And again, I don't know what they used or how they did it, but I mean, there's stories even that are more current. McDonald's, and I don't remember exactly what the issue was. McDonald's did a whole series of billboards in Minneapolis. In Hmong, there's a big Hmong population in Minneapolis, and it was just one line, and it was full of errors, and they didn't vet it. And usually that's really the case, is having it vetted. So, Rick brings up a good point. If you can get your English vetted, it's usually not an expensive service. Someone to just review it. We do it. We just give you some gotchas, some things that we see that will potentially be trouble in translation.
Do you
And then
see
you
this
make a
like all the time? Is this a source of volume for you where you just ping people and say, "Oh my God, who did your translations"?
It happens. One of our clients that's not in this space is Aldi Foods. So every non-food item in Aldi goes through our company, and those that have already translated their packaging still have to come to us. We have to review it, and there are times where we see things, this is terrible, here's 100 markups on a package. And they'll say, well, gosh, but it worked at Lowe's or it worked at Target or wherever. It's like, well,
Nobody
I guess they're not
complained
paying
there.
attention. Right? And the end is we're just trying to save embarrassment. But yes, it does come up a fair amount. For us, it's really a value add, because one of the first things we do when we launch a larger project is we try to form a glossary of common terms and get that translated and approved by the in-country folks to get buy-in. And then we look for the gotchas. And those are brought to the attention of the writer. And we fix those things, because here's the thing, another point that might be interesting is if you're doing a big release with 20 languages, keep in mind that you probably have 40 linguists working on that project. There's a translator and a proofreader in each language. So if you have a technical question or something that might be misunderstood, you want to nip that as quickly as possible, because otherwise you might have differences in the translated versions. So we try to create, we try to get anything that seems vague or unclear, important terminology, the gotchas, we try to work that out before we go to translation to avoid those issues, because sometimes that can be like herding cats when you have 40 linguists on a project.
I remember when you did a webinar for the group some years back, there were some maybe 7 to 10 kind of watchouts. Did we cover them all?
We covered regional, we covered client review, file formats. I think Justin had brought up the touchscreen. That was one that maybe we didn't go over. There's a lot of different file formats that happen in this industry. And keep in mind that you might be doing software applications, mobile applications, help in Madcap Flare, brochures in InDesign. And it's important that your translation provider understands how to parse out the code and focus on the translation so that you can get more leverage out of that translation memory database. And here's why that's important, because you might be translating a website today, but tomorrow it might be a brochure, or then you might be pushing it out to an application. And you want to make sure that there's maximum consistency no matter the project type. And all too often, translation agencies will allow sort of sloppy processing. In other words, well, that's all right, we'll cut and paste out of your website. We don't need the code, or they'll do sort of what I consider to be a band-aid approach to just get you through the short-term need without understanding the long-term ramifications. And because all of you are in sort of this iterative process when it comes to your software, your brochures, your manuals, your help, whatever it is, your most valuable asset is going to be that translation memory database. And the proper parsing of your files and separating of the code from the content is going to save you a lot of money. Because remember, again, if you're in a wider audience, if you're doing 20 languages, any problems you have, multiply them by the number of languages. Any cost overruns you have, multiply them by the number of languages. So if you're in if you have a wider audience, this is incredibly important to make sure that's taken care of. And that brings me up to the last one that we haven't covered, which is the ownership of that translation memory database. No matter who you work with, make sure before you do your first project that you get somewhere in writing that the translation memory database belongs to you and not to the agency. Also, make sure that they're not using it for other clients. When we set up a client, they get their own silo. So when I was doing Joe's stuff for cardiac science, we certainly weren't using it to generate content for space labs. That would be unethical. But a lot of agencies take all the material, dump it into one big database, and then they turn around and try to leverage it for other clients or even in an open MT engine. There was a recent issue with TransPerfect, well, I shouldn't say that, I guess, a big company, where they have this open resource where you can upload a file and you can choose like the basic level of service, which really in translation meant machine translation. And what it was a bunch of employee records, and the client didn't notice that in the terms of agreements, it said that basically your material could be placed into the public domain. And they used a hybrid of the Google Translate engine and their own translation memory database, big translation memory database. And this intrepid client Googled some of the results from the employee records and found them on the open web. A little bit of a lawsuit there. But it was in their terms of agreement, in the agreement. So they lost. So it was unfortunate. But yeah, you want to make sure that you hammer out all those details ahead of time. Number one, to avoid any issues. Number two, to make sure your IP isn't being shared. And number three, if you ever separate from that translation agency, because with that translation memory database, you could say, Peter, Argo, it's been nice working with you, but we're moving over to this other agency. They can pick up where you've left off. Translation's a big investment. You don't want to squander it, is what I would say.
Nice.
Peter, do you run into any issues between the language you guys call English and what we call English?
John, is that accent from the Bronx? Is that what I'm sensing?
Yeah,
He's
pretty
from
much.
South Carolina.
Southern Carolina.
Two squirrels.
South Carolina.
Yes, we do.
Oh, he's from the Southwest. Yeah.
We actually do. But we do have clients where it's important that they go to market looking like they have the intention of doing business in the UK or in Australia. So we do localization. We actually have editors in the UK and in Australia to make sure that, because there is differences in the language, absolutely. Besides the things that as Americans we joke about with UK English, there are some differences in terminology. I have one of my favorite off-color ones, but I'm going to share that one. I'm not going to share that one, so I'll help.
Do it. He just needs a little encouragement.
Fanny pack.
Oh, yes. That's not a good one in England.
That's not a good one. Not a good one.
Yeah,
Yeah,
my wife,
Oh,
when I took
I
my
get
wife
it now.
over, got into trouble with that one.
yeah, you don't want to use that one if you're ever in the UK. It's not called that.
Yeah. I lived in Australia a few years too, and so
Yes, they have the
some
same issue there.
yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely important. I mean, you have to look at where you're doing business, and if you're generating a lot of revenue, because we hear that a lot as well, that, well, we have English, they speak that there. Well, yes, but if it's an important market for you, I always say it's also the idea of effort. If you want to make a good impression on a client, present them something that they're comfortable at looking at and using that material. If it's that important, then it should be localized. And the funny thing is that's one of the lower cost services we have because it's editing. It's essentially editing. It's not retranslation. But by the way, we database that as well, so that then when you do your subsequent UK releases, that's also in translation memory. We treat it as a separate language, even though it's a minuscule fee to do the editing. We still database all of the results. Good question, John. And thanks for poking fun at US English as well.
I didn't think it was English.
Well, it's certainly not
American.
British. No doubt about that.
My kids were teenagers. They used to bring all their friends around and they'd ask me all these different questions, so that I'd mispronounce them.
Wonderful.
I got to jump off for just 1 minute.
No problem. Any other questions or points of discussion?
I'll just add for the I need to jump off kind of thing. These are very fluid. Come and go as you please. Interrupt. Take us in a different direction wherever the conversation leads, because this is for us. This is not a webinar. This is a bunch of teammates getting together and sharing ideas.
I guess I'm curious, for those of you that have taken a product and brought it into different markets, I guess I'm curious because I wish we were involved more often on the front end. Is it that translation becomes sort of an afterthought? Like I would imagine. So Brent, you're talking about the new product that you're launching. Your thoughts are mainly the US for now, I would imagine, but are you already thinking of other markets, or do you sort of have let me see if it takes off here and then go from there? How does that school of thought work?
Well,
Pretty much like quality and regulatory. It's the end of the line.
Yeah, just to give some background, what we normally do, this is a repetitive process that I do, is we bring the product to the point of market entry. We may even do a soft product launch, and then we are acquired. So the acquisition strategic will take over what they want to do in foreign markets. We advise them, we consult them, we give them ideas, but it's really up to them. And they're usually much slower on going internationally than I'd like. The one I sold to Medtronic 2014 still hasn't entered the international market yet, even though they've got a huge interest in it. So, they sort of take that over. Now, this current one we may take farther into market, but even then, we're going to be 3-4 years before we can even begin to tap the US market. So we really don't probably end up going international until 3 years out. So we're probably a little early to think about, how we look in foreign markets. A lot of issues in Japan right now. They have a huge aging population. They have a different aspect in terms of consideration of hygiene issues. So they had sort of a government crisis regarding, bladder issues. So we may end up going there sooner than we want, just based on demand. But that would still be 2 or 3 years out. And it probably won't be my company when it gets there.
Thank you for sharing that. That's interesting because even at the scale of Medtronic, who does a ton of business everywhere, it shows a certain level of caution, I guess, even with something. Well, they have money and they have resources, right?
I've done this several times. I will not mention company names in what I say right now, but I have been amazed at how poorly these things are planned out at the level of companies like Medtronic. You know, you would think that they have product launch down to a fine art. And I have now learned that that's the last thing I can count on.
Interesting.
Oh yeah. So, you know, we usually go in now to deals and tell them how it's going to be done, or we don't do the deal because it's like every time they launch a new product, it's brand new to them. You know, it's like they don't have any system to get it forward from there. And they spent 3 years developing a market I told them would be important, which is a senior market for our last product, and then got a new head of that division and tanked it.
Wow.
And people in that division took it themselves, took it over, and now it's just going gangbusters. So now I've learned there's a lot of smart people in companies like Medtronics, a lot of really skilled people, but as a functional unit, I have been less than impressed. It's not just them. We've sold other companies as well. So, and I'm sure Glenn has experience with that.
Yeah, it's surprising how sometimes things are not thought through as well as you would think. And, you know, this is, again, a little bit unrelated, but I think one of the things I find, this is more in product development side, I find that sometimes there's a hesitancy to share what a company is thinking about when it comes to designing a product to protect their intellectual property, which, you know, is understandable. But what ends up happening is that they end up creating a product in a vacuum and essentially building something, a product, answering a question that nobody's asking, you know, and that's a little different than the translation issue. But I could tell some stories about things I've seen people spend a year and a half and invest hundreds of thousands of dollars to come out with something that it's like, why would anybody want that? Did you talk to anybody in the healthcare field to see if it's really addressing something they care about? So I think it's, you know, kind of a related concept.
I think there's two reasons for that, Glenn, and you tell me if you agree or not. One is many times these companies are developed by engineering types.
Yes,
People
yes.
that they want to see applied into
Yes.
an aspect of healthcare.
Yep.
Sometimes, but rarely, it's going to be like myself. I'm a board certified urogynecologist with 35 years in the business, you know, who actually understands what the need is. Well, that need to an engineer on the outside looks different than if you're actually doing the job day to day.
Absolutely.
Get in the hands of a company like Boston Scientific or Medtronic, it ends up going through a series of committees. And each committee dulls the edge of your idea. So you have a spear tip that really addresses a certain need. And by the time it gets through 10 committees in 2 years, it's this kind of like vague, amorphous product that lost the ability to really achieve what it could have achieved. And that's why acquisitions now, we've clearly defined how it's going to go forward.
Yeah, you're right on with the engineering thing. I found that the three groups that don't understand product development, one is people coming from engineering or IT or technology background. They're really, you know, really bright people and no criticism, but they have no idea whether or not they're developing anything somebody wants. People from the business side do the same thing. And then believe it or not, a lot of clinicians do that. I was talking to one physician who had a product, clinically related product that was not selling very well. And she's from what I would call a third tier clinical specialty. It's not, you know, not denigrating if it wasn't cardiology or oncology, one of the major things. And her comment was, well, I would have thought the clinical value of what I put together would have sold my product. And I said, well, that's a nice thought, but you have no idea how complex the finances are and, you know, how every dollar available in a healthcare organization is being pulled in about 41 directions. And if you can't demonstrate why buying your product is financially neutral at minimum and advantageous at best, you know, you're wasting your time. So there's all these kind of cultural translational issues that can destroy opportunities. I spoke at a conference up in North Carolina a month ago, and one of the stats they were throwing around was that 99% of healthcare tech products fail. Now, I don't know what that's based on. I don't know if that's accurate, but you know, I wouldn't argue with that based on what I've seen.
Yeah, I would think it's high, but 99%.
Yeah, well,
one
I'm
time.
just quoting what I heard, so.
I wouldn't argue that, because I mean, you and I have both seen a huge number fail for all the reasons that you mentioned. You know, you need a combination of engineering, market insight, clinical on boots on the ground, backed
Yeah.
up with a compelling reason why anybody would spend the money on it.
Right.
Peter, just because I think this is a question you asked earlier. One of the things I've noticed about, front end and back end about getting ready, 20 years ago, in medical devices, especially the smaller companies, the focus was first go to Europe because you could either say it was easier, my terminology, it would be more predictable to get the CE marking approach first. But the pendulum has swung in the last 3 years. So now it's US first. So I think that's, and even Canada, for example, now that MedSap's involved and things like that, and language there, I think I see quite a drift now to starting in the US, particularly because of Q-sub and everything else with the FDA. So that may impact how things have changed over the years, because if you're starting off in Europe, you already know that you're going to be dealing with language issues. So just something I've noticed.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So your theory is that it's based on the ease of navigating the regulations to release, essentially.
Well, it's just a thing I've noticed over the years that most American medical device companies would start off in Europe simply because it was a more predictable path to get the CE marking than it was to deal with the FDA. But that has changed. I think it's swung completely around now.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Did we lose Joe? Oh, he's still here. I think we just lost his camera.
Joe shut off his camera for a moment.
Oh, okay.
He takes frequent bio breaks, okay?
Any other comments or questions or observations about translations?
I will observe that all of you can send Peter a direct message, continue the conversation. And you know what? I'm going to show you, I'll take the screen here. I'm going to show you how to do that because I had a conversation with a young lady who's in our network who could not figure out how to add someone to a conversation. So it'll be a little different for me because I have everyone up, but anyone who wants to find someone, click on the plus sign or open a direct message. And this is a list of everybody on the network. So if I wanted to say hi to Andre, I click on him, I say go, and I say, what up, dude? And then I can go /Giphy, and because I know he likes dogs, I can decide Giphy I'm going to send there. Well, that's really for Michelle. She's all about yeah, I'll give you that one.
Thank you.
And the nice thing about this is, it's hard to explain all of the benefits of being part of this thing, but I'm shooting a video later today. That's why I've got my nice shirt on and I've got my camera ready to go right after this call. I got one up there. Personally, as a social animal, I get such joy out of just saying good morning. It makes it feel so much less isolating being in this room by myself and my dog, feeling connected to all of you. So what I've done, and this is another trick that I learned, is I've starred each of you so that I can easily see when your lights are on. Now, I don't expect anyone else to do this, but I'm your cruise director, so that's something I've chosen to do. But if I were not to talk with Andre again for another 2 weeks, his name would drop off and I would have to find him again if he were not starred. So that's the way I do it, to keep a list of who. And then another thing I'll remind you about is the link that has a link to everyone in the network. Now, we're recording this and I'm putting it on YouTube for later, so I'm not going to share that right now. Maybe after I hit the stop recording button, but you're all entitled to a directory of every single person, their LinkedIn profiles, their email addresses, so that we become the community that I very much see us becoming. Let me, I guess, formally conclude Peter's presentation. We all give him a Nancy Pelosi clap. And one of the things I like to do too, if, you know, again, with the caveat that anyone can jump off whenever they like, if there's anything any of us want to share about anything that you're working on, something that you think you could teach the rest of the group, kind of like a fast round of did you know that's, I'll start.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to sign off. I have to get ready for something else.
Okay.
So thank you so much for letting me be on this call. It's very interesting. Great work.
Come back anytime.
Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks so much. Yep.
Thanks,
Bye
Glenn.
now.
Now, do you run a consulting service, Glenn?
Sorry?
Do you run a consulting service?
Yes, I do. Yes.
You do any work in Tennessee?
Well, I did some work with the Tennessee Hospital Association, helping them find a vendor for one of the things they were looking at. I've had some conversations. I'm sorry?
One of the markets we're looking at is hospital market next year. So I'll reach out to you on direct message.
Yeah. Well, that's my specialty. I mean, I spent 30 years in that field, so that's
Well,
what I do.
Direct message. I won't take the rest of their time.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
It's being done here.
Yeah.
The connections.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to show you an important thing, and Rick and I talked about this briefly offline this week and from last week. How many of you post at all on LinkedIn?
I do some.
Okay, so this is something I just put up here. I took a snapshot of today's call. I got a particularly good shot of Peter laughing with John. And I wrote, okay, I'm just going to keep posting these. We meet every week as a team. This week, Peter taught us about translation. Next week, Nicholas is going to teach us about reimbursement. This is showing what we do. And it doesn't have to be an article that took 5 hours to write. It doesn't have to be, it's just something contemporary. I don't know what the two comments are, but let's see already what they are. Oh, they were me, but Brent, I was going to, they're gone because I deleted them. I was trying to, this is just a LinkedIn thing. I was trying to tag Brent, but I suspect Brent has his settings in such a way that he can't be tagged on anything, but I had to trial and error to figure that out. I was going to give you credit for showing your device on call, but we'll talk about it as your marketer, whatever. But here's the one I wanted to show you. Yesterday I posted, I shared this in the premium too, on the marketing channel. I got my first lame Christmas email yesterday, and it reminded me about this years old article that I wrote. This picture here was not what would have shown up had I not taken the extra time and attention to create it. Now, there's a way to do it, I can show you, but the point is that in almost all of your websites, if you're sharing a blog or something, when you share a link, LinkedIn will try to pull the first image in that article if there is an image. If there is no image, it will just give you like this gray bar of whatever it is that you have. Or if you create an image for this space and put it in a certain place, which I can show you where it is, you can have this be anything you want it to be. So what I had before would not have served this purpose, but recognizing that I was going to post it here, I created this image for this thing to make it more interesting and more likely to be clicked on. So my marketing lesson of the week is if/when you share on LinkedIn, make sure that you know what this is going to look like. And the way you can do that is you can go to linkedin.com post inspector, post-inspector. So for example, if I'm going to show you something that I know doesn't have a, this is a link to the PDF of the San Diego 10X show. And there's no way that I know of to associate an image with a PDF. So this is what it's going to look like. Now, this is a real link. It really works. It would take you to a PDF, but this is all you would see in that box. Because there's no image that LinkedIn can find associated with this URL. It's just a PDF. Whereas, when I invite someone to check out Premium, I'm very careful to make sure that there's an image there that makes sense to help tell the story that I'm trying to tell. I created this image specifically for this purpose, specifically at this size, and I specifically put in this language to show up so that it helps tell my story when I just put the link, as opposed to just some gray nonsense that is not inviting. This will almost invariably happen too with any FDA link that you put there. It's just going to be this gray mass of nothing because there's no image associated with it. End of lesson.
Good, thank you.
You're welcome. Does anyone have anything they'd like to add, or shall we all go on our way?
Joe, one quick thing before everybody goes. Did you all receive the email from MDMA about writing to the elected officials regarding the medical device tax?
Yes.
Did everybody respond?
Yes.
Okay, it is important. I've been on this from the very beginning. You can see some of my testimony in Congress and stuff, but nevertheless, we just got to keep on pounding on them. Obviously, I'm hitting my New Jersey representatives, and I have all my employees reaching out to wherever they live. So, you know, we just got to keep on this because that was the biggest death knell we could have had, and we've got to avoid this at all costs.
I'm very surprised. I mean, maybe it's just that our executive branch has distracted us to, you know, away from the legislative branch to focus on this. But this seems like a very Republican issue not to let this tax come back. I don't know.
Joe, let me just interrupt you. I have sent certified letters to the White House. I've sent all kinds of stuff to representatives there. I happen to know somebody that's on the staff there. I get back the polite, we got your letter, we got your certified letter. We're going to get to this. I think it's a natural of reducing, legislation. It's just unbelievable. Unfortunately, it's not on the radar right now. But we just got to keep at it. We can't give up.
You might recall, back in 2012, I launched a site called no2.3.com.
Absolutely.
Do you remember it?
Of course.
There you go. Okay. So yeah, I was very involved with it, and those were some interesting times. Really.
Yeah, no, I had just recently, I had a meeting, an in-person meeting with our local Congressman Pascrell. I got his commitment, at least that's what he says. But he says it's not anywhere for him to vote on. It's not anywhere to talk about. So we just got to get it out again,
You know what? I think I'll write about that for Tuesday.
Please do. Please do.
Yeah, I think I will.
Yeah, the House has got to start that, don't they? I mean, whoever our representative is.
It's actually in committee, and the point is that if you respond to the MDMA email request, which gives you the automatic email, it'll put it in front of some of the committee members. It's got to come out of that committee to the Congress. So we're one step away from being in front of the whole Congress. We got to get, it's still sitting there in limbo, and that's not good. We got to get it off the table.
Yeah, I didn't see that email, but I'm going to look for it. And
can we post that?
And respond.
No, can we post that link there?
Yep, I absolutely will. I'll find it right now.
It just takes a second. You just click on it, automatically sends an email to your representatives based on your zip code. Everybody should do it. You should get your friends, your neighbors, your relatives, everybody to do this. I even sent it to one of my social groups having nothing to do with the medical device field, and I told them how important it was. So I've got people out of the blue, out of this industry, sending it in.
I'm going to send this right now to, I'm going to put it in announcements. That's the one place I have that goes out to everyone, and that's the one channel I've reserved for just me.
Okay. Everybody should do this ASAP.
Well, and stick it in the, I guess you're typing it in right now, but put it in the chat.
All right, I will.
Thank you, Joe. It's important.
Thank you for reminding me.
Yeah, my congressman's not doing much right now. This would be something for him to do. Really help.
That was me sending it to
There it is.
everyone on Slack, but I've just put it here in GoToMeeting as well. I'll stop the recording, but just, Andre, just for your amusement, if you care. When I first learned about this, so I inherited this group at the end of 2011 when Chris Taylor died. You probably know that.
Yes.
And the medical device tax was the first major conversation that was held on the platform. And it was a discussion that had been there before I got here. So it was in the month or so between Chris's death and me inheriting the group. It was written by a man named Robert Trinka, who became a good friend. And he wrote, "What do you all think of the tongue depressor tax?" And by the time I showed up, there were some 600 comments or so, I think. It was like one of those. And John Eckberg, who's become one of my closest friends out of this whole experiment, tracked me down and encouraged me to do something about it with the group. In fact, Cook Group, his company, was my main financial supporter to make it happen. I mean, there were expenses associated with getting it up and maintaining it and such. And I asked him to help me provoke conversation with it. And I could find it, but offhand, it's all in the subject line. As a marketer, if you don't have the right subject line, don't bother. So the email that I sent out to what was then about 110,000 people was, should you tell your senator not to send your job to China or something like that? And boy, did I get an earful. I had never been ripped in public online before. It was my first exposure to, it wasn't even trolling. It was very pointed. One of the comments, which I thought was very interesting, was, interesting. You should just be like the moderator here. You shouldn't be sticking your opinion on this thing. And I was like, yeah, because I'm a group member just like anybody else. Just so happens that, you know. What was interesting to me is I assumed that if I wrote to the medical devices group,
Right,
don't let us have a medical devices tax, everyone would be like, of course.
you would think.
but it wasn't. And there was a good third of the people who were like disagreeing actively in this open debate. And some of them
How does that even
were
happen?
very interesting. And you'll remember in 2013, Peter and Rick, I had some international folks come. And the reason Amy Klobuchar came was to talk about the tax. Eric Paulson came as well. And the international guys, to a person, were like, we love this tax.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Of course.
They thought it was great.
The best thing that could happen to us.
Of course. Of course.
And John was all about how, you know, people were opening this new facility in Ireland, and every time somebody, we're moving to Costa Rica, we're moving to Ireland, and he was like, he had this number he would love to throw out, you know, every 30 minutes, the equivalent of a $90,000 job is being lost in America because of this tax. He was extremely vocal.
Joe, just to let you know, I actually heard from John Eckberg because I appeared on a segment on CNN and also on Fox News. And
Do you still have those links?
The video clips?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Share them.
All right, I will. But and that's what
interest.
And that's when John Eckberg called me and actually he thanked me and he gave me a lot of those statistics for my next appearances. You know, he gave me one which I loved that I used all the time, that there's 2 million jobs that are in the medical device field, and 80% of them are in companies that are in 50 employees or less. And I said, you know, you're attacking a small company business with an excise tax. Excise tax are usually sin taxes on gasoline and tobacco. And what the hell does this have to do with a medical device?
He gave me the same prep when I went on NPR, and the folks at AdvaMed never talked to me again after that, because I went off their talk track. Their talk track was every tax bad. And my talk track was, look, if you've got to tax the industry, at least be fair about it. At least do it on profit, not on revenue.
Exactly. Not
That
on
doesn't
top
make
line
any
revenue.
sense. But
And
they
then-
didn't like me giving an inch there. It had to be an absolute no tax. And I was like, come on, at least fair tax. And that was not on script.
Yep.
Persona non grata.
Right. Well, we're all on the same page here, so let's make sure we get others on the page with us.
Okay, everyone put your hands towards the camera and go, let's do it.
I just filled it out, and my congressman's my neighbor, so I'm just going to go next door right afterwards.
Oh,
Like
please,
literally
Peter, that'd be great.
Jan Schakowsky is my neighbor, so I will go next door.
Next door to your office or your home?
No, next door to my office.
That's cool.
Yeah, they come to our holiday party, so I'll make sure to mention it then as well.
When's your holiday party?
The 19th.
It's going to be a little late. You'll have 11 days and Christmas and all that.
Well, I'm going there right now as well, but she usually comes to the party. She won't be next door now, but she usually comes in for our holiday party. So.
And what do we all have to do to get invited to this party?
Come to Chicago and visit. You're all welcome anytime.
All right. I'm going to see if there's anyone in Chicago to come to your party.
That'd be great. That'd be wonderful.
Yeah. Actually, you know what? I'll stop the recording now and I'll give you that link again. Bye, everybody, on the recording.